For 11 months, Matthew Leary never gave the quiet maid a second glance. She cleaned his mansion, served his guests, disappeared before anyone noticed she was gone. Invisible, just another employee. Then one rainy evening, after surviving an assassination attempt, Matthew watched her leave carrying 2 heavy grocery bags through a storm that had emptied the streets. Something didn't feel right. Against his own better judgment, the city's most feared mafia boss slipped into an unmarked SUV and followed her. He expected a secret boyfriend, a second job, maybe unpaid debts. Instead, he watched Emma Jensen unlock the rusted doors of an abandoned church. The lights flickered on. Children began appearing from the darkness, hungry, barefoot, terrified. Emma greeted every one of them by name. She served hot meals made from leftovers she'd quietly saved from Matthew's mansion. She stitched torn clothes, read bedtime stories, tucked frightened children into makeshift beds. Matthew stood frozen in the rain. The woman he'd barely noticed had been quietly saving lives, while the rest of the city looked away. But as one little boy nervously handed Emma a crumpled drawing, Matthew's blood ran cold. It wasn't a child's doodle. It was the unmistakable symbol of an organization he believed he'd buried forever. Someone had resurrected an evil from his past, and the only people standing in its way were a maid with an unbreakable heart and the mafia boss who had just discovered he finally had something worth losing. Before we rewind to an ordinary rainy evening at the Leary mansion, if you believe the quietest people in any room are often the ones holding everyone else together, hit subscribe, because Emma Jensen is about to prove that in ways you won't see coming. And tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered someone you overlooked was secretly carrying an entire world on their shoulders? Also, drop where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. Type Miss Emma below if this one already has your heart before we've even started. Now, let's get back into the story. The bullet missed Matthew Leary's head by 4 inches. He didn't flinch. He'd learned, years ago, that flinching wasted time he didn't have. And in the half-second it took most men to register fear, Matthew was already moving, dropping low behind the marble planter outside his own front steps, watching Daniel Cross put 2 rounds into the shooter's position before the man had a chance to fire again. Silence. After. The particular silence of a threat neutralized. His security team already fanning across the property, sweeping for a second gunman who never materialized. Clean shot, Daniel said, holstering his weapon, jaw tight. One man. Amateur positioning. This wasn't Castellano's people. Too sloppy. Then whose? Working on it, boss. Matthew straightened his jacket, brushed gravel from his sleeve, and walked back into his own mansion like nothing at all had happened. Because in his world, nothing had. An assassination attempt on a Tuesday afternoon was simply Tuesday. He was 38 years old, and he could not remember the last time his pulse had genuinely spiked over anything. Inside, the household moved around the incident with the same practiced calm. Staff continuing their duties, the kind of controlled normalcy Matthew had spent years cultivating, specifically so his home would never feel like the war zone his business sometimes required it to be. Emma Jensen was polishing the banister when he passed, exactly as she had been an hour earlier, apparently entirely unbothered by the gunfire that had briefly punctuated the afternoon. "You're still here," he said, more observation than question. "Where else would I be? The floors don't dust themselves, Mr. Leary. Believe me, I've asked them politely." He paused, something in her dry tone catching him off guard the way it occasionally did. A small, unexpected snag in the otherwise seamless fabric of his day. In 11 months, Emma Jensen had cleaned his mansion, served his guests, and moved through his household with a quiet efficiency he'd noted only in passing, the way one noted good plumbing: reliable, present, unremarkable. "You heard the gunfire?" "I did." She set down her polishing cloth, meeting his eyes without the flicker of fear he was accustomed to seeing in nearly everyone who worked for him. "You seem unharmed, so I assumed continuing to dust was the more useful response than screaming. Most people scream regardless. I contain multitudes." She picked the cloth back up, already returning to her work. "Also, I've found panic rarely improves a situation. It just uses up air you might need for thinking clearly." Matthew stood a moment longer than necessary, unable to quite name what had shifted in that brief exchange, before continuing toward his study, the echo of her voice trailing him longer than it should have. At 7 o'clock precisely, as she did every evening, Emma gathered her coat and 2 canvas bags from the kitchen. Bags Matthew had noticed before, vaguely, the way he noticed most things without truly examining them. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate, he found himself watching from his study window as she crossed the courtyard toward the gate. "She's declining the driver again," Daniel said, appearing at his shoulder with a tablet full of post-incident reports. "4th time this month. She's declined it every night for 11 months. You've noticed that?" Matthew didn't answer, his eyes still tracking Emma's figure as she reached the gate, bags heavy enough that her shoulders dipped slightly with the weight, rain beginning to needle down from a sky that had been threatening it all afternoon. "She's carrying groceries," he said slowly, "every night. Even nights I know she hasn't had time to shop. Maybe she meal preps. For an army?" Matthew's eyes narrowed, some old familiar instinct sharpening beneath the mild curiosity. The same instinct that had kept him alive through the afternoon's gunfire, the one that never quite believed in coincidence. "Pull her file. Boss, it's her day off in 6 hours. Whatever she's doing, it's probably just, pull it anyway." The file, when it arrived 20 minutes later, told him almost nothing useful. Emma Jensen, 31. No family listed. Foster care background. Clean record. Punctual to a fault. Nothing that explained 2 heavy grocery bags carried nightly into a neighborhood that wasn't, according to her listed address, anywhere near her actual apartment. "I'm following her," Matthew said, already reaching for his coat. "That's a terrible idea after an assassination attempt, boss. You should be locked down tonight, not wandering the city on foot. Then come with me and keep your opinions to yourself." They found her 3 blocks from the mansion, walking briskly through the storm, with her collar turned up against the rain, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with heading toward the bus stop she usually favored. Matthew directed the SUV to hang back, watching through rain-streaked glass as Emma boarded a public bus heading east, away from the affluent streets of her employer's world, toward a part of the city Matthew's own organization rarely bothered patrolling, because there was nothing there worth protecting. Or so he'd always assumed. She transferred buses twice, walked the final stretch on foot despite the rain soaking through her coat, and Matthew watched with a growing, unfamiliar unease as the neighborhood around her grew steadily rougher. Boarded windows, broken streetlights, the particular emptiness of blocks the city had quietly given up on. She stopped in front of an old church, its steeple leaning, stained glass long since boarded over, and pulled a ring of keys from her coat pocket. "That building's condemned," Daniel said quietly, checking something on his tablet. "Slated for demolition 18 months ago. City never got around to it." Emma unlocked the door with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it hundreds of times before, slipping inside, and moments later, faint light bled through the boarded windows. Flashlight beams, maybe, or old lanterns, warm and unmistakably deliberate. Then Matthew saw movement in the alleys around the church. Small shapes, emerging from doorways and gaps between buildings, converging on the old church with a familiarity that told him this wasn't the first time. Children. A dozen, then more. Thin coats and worn shoes, moving through the rain, toward the one lit building in 3 empty blocks. Matthew's chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years. "Boss," Daniel said slowly, "what is this?" Through the church's cracked doorway, Matthew watched Emma Jensen kneel down, gathering a small, shivering child into her arms, with the same easy warmth she'd shown polishing his banister that afternoon. utterly unremarkable to her, entirely unprecedented to him. A little girl broke from the group and approached Emma directly, holding out a folded, crumpled piece of paper with trembling hands. Emma took it gently, unfolding it beneath the church's flickering light. Matthew's blood went cold. Even from across the street, through rain and darkness and 11 months of never once truly looking at the woman who dusted his banister, he recognized the symbol drawn in careful, childish lines on that crumpled page. A black shield, crowned in silver. The black crest. Matthew didn't move for a long moment, rain soaking through his collar, his mind refusing to reconcile what he was looking at with everything he thought he knew about the world. "Boss." Daniel's voice was low, urgent. "That symbol. I know what it is. That's not possible. Your father buried that organization 15 years ago. I know what he told me." Matthew's jaw tightened, eyes still fixed on the crumpled drawing in Emma's hands. Apparently I was wrong to believe it. He watched Emma fold the paper carefully, tuck it into her coat pocket without a flicker of the alarm he felt radiating through his own chest, and return her attention to the little girl who'd handed it to her. Smoothing damp hair back from a frightened face, murmuring something too quiet to hear, coaxing a small, tentative smile from a child who looked like she hadn't smiled easily in a very long time. Whatever this drawing meant, Emma clearly had no idea of its significance. To her, it seemed to be simply one more piece of a childhood too frightened to explain itself in words. Matthew crossed the street before he'd fully decided to. She saw him before he reached the door. Of course she did, he thought, feeling oddly foolish for assuming a woman who'd built an entire secret operation right under his nose might somehow miss a 6'3" man in a rain-soaked overcoat crossing an empty street toward her. Emma stepped outside, pulling the door mostly closed behind her, putting her body deliberately between Matthew and the children still filing in out of the rain. "Mr. Leary," her voice was calm, though something sharp had entered it, wariness dressed up as politeness. "This is unexpected. I followed you. I gathered that, given you're standing in the rain outside a condemned church at 8 o'clock at night." She crossed her arms, unbothered by the admission, in a way that told him she'd half-expected discovery eventually. "I assume you have questions." "Several. I'll answer what I can, but quietly, please. Some of them scare easily." He nodded, and she led him a short distance from the door, close enough to keep watch, but far enough that their conversation wouldn't carry inside. "How long?" he said. 2 years. A little longer, maybe." She glanced back toward the church, warmth entering her expression despite the tension between them. "It started with one boy. I found him sleeping behind the restaurant where I used to wait tables, maybe 9 years old, hadn't eaten in days. I couldn't just walk past him." A small shrug. "Then there was another, and another. Eventually I found this place. Father Gabriel lets me use it. Quietly, off the books. We don't advertise. The city would shut it down in a heartbeat if they knew. Too many code violations, not enough funding to fix them, and then these kids are back on the street with nothing. There are 40 children in there, give or take." Something fierce entered her voice. "And every single one of them eats better because of the leftovers your kitchen throws away every night, Mr. Leary. So, if you're about to lecture me about propriety, I'd ask you to reconsider." Despite everything, the gunfire, the drawing, the impossible resurrection of an organization he'd believed dead for 15 years, Matthew felt something close to a smile tug at his mouth. "I wasn't going to lecture you." "No? I was going to ask why you never told anyone." Emma looked at him for a long moment, rain dripping steadily from the church's broken gutter between them. "Because the moment people know," she said quietly, "they start deciding what to do about it. Usually that means closing it down, moving the kids somewhere official, somewhere with waiting lists and paperwork, and no guarantee anyone actually gets helped faster than they would have been helped right here." Her jaw tightened. "I grew up in that system, Mr. Leary. I know exactly how many kids fall through its cracks. I'd rather feed 40 kids quietly than watch the system lose track of them loudly. I could help. Resources, funding, a legitimate building instead of a condemned church. Money isn't the problem. Emma's eyes held his, steady and unflinching in a way that unsettled him more than any threat he'd faced that day. People looking away is, I don't need a check, Mr. Leary. I need people to stop pretending kids like this don't exist. Matthew had no answer for that. He'd spent 14 years running an empire built on precisely that kind of practiced blindness, looking away from whatever didn't serve his interests, cultivating a reputation that made people too afraid to ask questions he didn't want answered. Emma Jensen had just handed him, without any apparent awareness of doing so, a mirror he hadn't asked for and couldn't quite look away from. She led him inside a few minutes later. Against every instinct, his security training screamed at him, introducing him quietly to the children as a friend, while Matthew took in the makeshift beds, the careful order beneath the chaos, the sheer scale of what one woman had built alone in the shadows of a city that had stopped looking. A rail-thin cook, Rosie, Emma explained, from his own kitchen staff, apparently in on the secret from the beginning, was ladling stew into mismatched bowls with the same warm efficiency she brought to Matthew's own dinner table. You knew, Matthew said. Someone had to help her carry the bags. Rosie didn't look up from her ladle, entirely unbothered by his presence. Don't look so betrayed, Mr. Leary. It wasn't exactly a state secret from anyone who bothered to notice. He was still absorbing that when Emma touched his arm, steering him gently toward a small girl sitting alone in the corner, sketchbook clutched tight against her chest. This is Sophie, Emma said softly. She doesn't talk much, hasn't since I found her, about 8 months back. Sophie didn't look up. Her pencil moved steadily across the paper, the same careful, practiced lines Matthew had watched from across the street minutes earlier. He crouched slowly, keeping his distance, and looked at the page taking shape beneath her hand. A black shield, crowned in silver. The same symbol, drawn again, with the unconscious repetition of someone who had drawn it so many times it no longer required thought. She draws that a lot, Emma said quietly, watching his face carefully. I always assumed it was something she saw on television. A logo, maybe. She won't tell me where it's from. It's not from television. Something in his voice made Emma go very still. Matthew, what is that symbol? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. Daniel, waiting outside, his message brief and cold enough to send ice through Matthew's chest. Warehouse 4 just burned. Total loss. They spray-painted the outer wall before they torched it. A photograph followed, grainy and hurried, but legible enough. 3 words, painted in dripping red letters across the scorched brick. We never died. Matthew stared at the photograph for a long moment, the warmth of the church at his back doing nothing to thaw the cold settling through his chest. What is it? Emma asked, watching his face with the same careful attention she seemed to give everything. He turned the phone toward her, watching her expression shift from confusion to something sharper as she read the words scrawled across his burned warehouse. Someone's making a statement, he said quietly. And judging by Sophie's drawing, I don't think it's a coincidence they chose tonight. You still haven't told me what that symbol means. Matthew glanced back toward the corner where Sophie sat, pencil once again moving across a fresh page, entirely absorbed in whatever private world she retreated to when she drew. He lowered his voice, drawing Emma a few steps further away. 15 years ago, my father discovered an organization operating beneath half the legitimate institutions in this city, he said. Politicians, judges, police commissioners, wealthy businessmen who'd never once appear in a criminal database. They called themselves the Black Crest. They trafficked children, Emma, controlled entire branches of government through blackmail and fear. My father spent months at war with them, and when it ended, everyone believed he'd destroyed them completely. Believed? He told me they were gone. I believed him for 15 years. Matthew's jaw tightened. I think now he was wrong. Or he was lying to protect me from something he never finished. Emma's eyes flicked towards Sophie, understanding dawning slowly and painfully across her face. She's not drawing a logo she saw on television, Emma said softly. She's remembering something, isn't she? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. He returned to the church 3 more times over the following week, each visit stretching longer than the last, each conversation with Emma peeling back another layer of a woman he was beginning to realize he'd catastrophically underestimated for nearly a year. You should eat something, she told him on the 4th evening, setting a bowl of Rosie's stew in front of him without waiting for permission. The same brisk efficiency she brought to dusting his banister now redirected entirely toward making sure he didn't collapse from exhaustion. You've barely slept since the warehouse fire. I don't have time to eat. You don't have time not to. Exhausted men make sloppy decisions, Mr. Leary. And given what you've told me about the people we're apparently dealing with, sloppy strikes me as a poor strategy. She sat across from him, arms crossed, entirely unmoved by his glare. Eat? Then tell me what Daniel found. Matthew ate. He'd stopped, somewhere in the last week, questioning why he obeyed her instructions so readily. Daniel traced the accelerant used at the warehouse, he said finally. Military grade, not something a street crew could source easily. Whoever did this has resources most organizations in this city simply don't have access to. Government resources. Or corporate ones. Possibly both. He rubbed his eyes, the fatigue she'd correctly identified pressing harder now that he'd acknowledged it. The Black Crest was never just criminals, Emma. That was the entire danger of them. They existed inside legitimate institutions, which means whoever rebuilt them likely inherited that same infrastructure, which means you can't simply shoot your way through this one. No. Something almost like a smile crossed his face, brief and tired. This one requires patience I'm not naturally gifted with. Then it's fortunate you've got me. She said it lightly, teasing, but something steadier lay beneath it. A genuine offer, freely given. I notice things, Matthew. Small things. It's how I do my job well. Maybe it'll be useful for this too. He studied her for a long moment. You understand the danger, if you involve yourself further. I've been feeding 40 children out of an abandoned church for 2 years, without being caught by the city, my employer, or apparently anyone else, until you followed me home in the rain. I think I have some idea of managing danger quietly. Her eyes held his, steady and unafraid. Sophie's remembering something real. I want to know what happened to her, Matthew. Not just for the mystery, because that little girl deserves to feel safe again. And I don't think she will, until whoever did this is stopped. Something shifted in Matthew's chest, warm and unfamiliar, watching the fierce, quiet resolve in her face. Then we do this together. Daniel arrived at the church unannounced the following afternoon, tablet in hand, expression carefully neutral in the way Matthew had learned meant bad news. We pulled everything we could on Father Gabriel, he said, glancing toward the small rectory attached to the back of the church. Nothing alarming on paper, retired priest, clean record, been letting Emma use this building informally for 2 years. He hesitated. But I cross-referenced his ordination records against old case files from your father's war, 15 years ago. Gabriel served as a chaplain for the Boston PD during that period. He would have had access to information about the original investigation. You think he knows something? I think it's worth asking him directly. Emma frowned, glancing toward the rectory door, unease crossing her face. He's usually up by now, making his morning coffee, complaining about his knees. She checked her watch. It's nearly noon. Matthew felt the same cold unease sharpen in his own chest, following her toward the small rectory door, knocking once, twice, receiving only silence in return. Father Gabriel? Emma's voice had gone tight with worry. Matthew tried the handle, unlocked. He pushed the door open slowly, Daniel's hand already moving toward his weapon out of pure instinct. The rectory was empty. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing so dramatic as a break-in. Simply an empty room, a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold on the small kitchen table, and a coat still hanging on its hook by the door. Emma's breath caught. On the floor near the window, catching the pale afternoon light, lay a single object. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses, one lens cracked clean through, the frame bent at an angle that told its own quiet, terrible story. Father Gabriel was gone. Emma knelt slowly, picking up the broken glasses with hands that had begun to shake, despite her best effort to hide it. "He wouldn't just leave," she said. "Not without telling me. Not without making sure the children were settled first. He's done this for years, Matthew. He wouldn't just—" "He didn't leave." Matthew crouched beside her, examining the scuff marks on the floorboards near the window, the kind of drag pattern that told a story neither of them wanted to hear. "Someone took him." "Why?" "He's just an old priest who let me use his church." "He's an old priest who served as police chaplain during my father's war against the Black Crest 15 years ago." Matthew's jaw tightened. If he knew anything about that investigation, anything at all, he's suddenly the most dangerous kind of loose end to whoever's rebuilding this organization. Daniel was already on his phone, coordinating a sweep of the surrounding blocks, though Matthew doubted they'd find anything useful. Whoever had taken Father Gabriel had done it cleanly, quietly, in broad daylight without a single neighbor noticing. "We need to search the church," Matthew said. "Thoroughly. If Gabriel knew something worth silencing him over, there's a chance he left evidence of it somewhere he trusted." Emma nodded, wiping her eyes quickly, steadying herself with the same fierce resolve Matthew was beginning to recognize as fundamental to who she was. "He kept an old Bible in the rectory," she said. "Family heirloom, he told me once. Never let anyone touch it, not even to dust the shelf it sat on. I always thought it was sentiment." Her eyes sharpened. Maybe it was something else. They found the Bible exactly where Emma remembered, tucked on a high shelf above Gabriel's narrow bed, its leather cover cracked with age and its spine soft from decades of handling. Matthew opened it carefully, flipping through pages of delicate script until a folded square of paper slipped free, landing on the bedspread between them. Emma unfolded it with careful fingers. Not a note. A list. Names, dates, and a series of numbers that meant nothing to Matthew at first glance, until he recognized 3 of the names immediately. "These are police officers," he said slowly. "From my father's original investigation. Men who worked the Black Crest case 15 years ago. Half of them have dates beside their names, recent ones." Emma's finger traced down the list, stopping abruptly. "Matthew, these read like an obituary list." He took the paper, studying it more closely, and felt something cold settle in his stomach as the pattern sharpened into focus. 6 names, 6 dates spanning the last 3 years. Men who had once investigated the Black Crest, each one dying. Quietly, unremarkably, the kind of deaths that never made headlines or drew suspicion. "They've been cleaning house," Matthew said. "Anyone who knew anything real about the original investigation. Gabriel must have realized it and started keeping records, in case something happened to him too. Which means they know he knew." Emma's voice had gone tight with fear she was clearly working hard to control. "Matthew, if they took him for this list, what happens when they realize he might have told someone else?" Matthew looked up from the paper, meeting her eyes, understanding arriving in both of them at exactly the same terrible moment. "They'll come for you next." The attempt came 2 nights later, exactly as Matthew had feared it might. Emma was walking the final stretch toward the church, grocery bags heavy in her hands as always, when a black van pulled sharply against the curb ahead of her, its side door sliding open before she'd fully registered the danger. She didn't scream. Later, she'd tell Matthew that some instinct, years of foster homes, years of learning exactly which situations required silence and speed instead of noise, had simply taken over, dropping the grocery bags and bolting sideways into the narrow alley beside the closed bakery, before the 2 men emerging from the van had crossed half the distance toward her. They were faster than she expected. A hand closed around her arm just as she reached the alley's far end, wrenching her backward with enough force to nearly buckle her knees. The gunshot that followed didn't come from her attacker. Daniel emerged from the shadows across the street, weapon already raised, dropping the man holding her with a single controlled shot before the second attacker had even processed what was happening. Matthew was 3 steps behind him, having insisted, over Daniel's strenuous objection, on personally overseeing security near the church every night since Gabriel's disappearance. The second man fled toward the van, and Matthew let him go, his priority narrowing entirely to Emma, who stood frozen against the alley wall, breathing hard, grocery items scattered across the wet pavement around her. Emma? He reached her in seconds, hands finding her shoulders, checking for injury with a gentleness that surprised even him. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." Her voice shook despite the words. I dropped the groceries. Rosie's going to be so annoyed. I bought the good bread." "Emma." "I'm fine, Matthew." She met his eyes, something fierce breaking through the fear. "I'm fine." He pulled her into his arms before either of them had fully decided to allow it, and she let him, her hands fisting in his coat, both of them shaking with an adrenaline that had nothing left to do but simply hold on. Sophie was waiting when they finally returned to the church, her small face pale with worry, sketchbook clutched against her chest as always. She didn't ask what had happened. She rarely asked anything at all, but her eyes tracked Emma's shaken expression with a careful, watchful attention that suggested she understood more than her silence let on. That night, once the younger children were settled, and Rosie had fussed over Emma's scraped palm with more coffee than the situation strictly required, Sophie approached Matthew directly for the first time since he'd started visiting the church. She held out her sketchbook without a word. Matthew took it carefully, turning to the freshly drawn page, and felt his breath catch entirely. Not the black crest symbol this time. A face. Carefully rendered, unmistakable despite the childish lines, a woman's face Matthew had seen 100 times before, on campaign posters, on the evening news, smiling warmly beside ribbon cuttings and charity galas across the entire city. Mayor Eleanor Whitmore. Matthew stared at the drawing for a long moment, the warmth of the church doing nothing to thaw the ice spreading through his chest. "Sophie." He crouched slowly to her eye level, keeping his voice gentle in a way that felt entirely unnatural after years of commanding rooms through fear alone. "Do you know this woman?" Sophie's eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't answer, but her small hands tightened around the edge of her sketchbook, and that was answer enough. "She doesn't need to talk about it tonight," Emma said quietly, kneeling beside them, one hand resting protectively on Sophie's shoulder. "Whatever she remembers, it's clearly still hurting her to remember it." Matthew nodded, closing the sketchbook gently and handing it back to Sophie, who retreated immediately to Rosie's side across the room, small shoulders hunched inward like she was trying to disappear. "Eleanor Whitmore," Matthew said once Sophie was out of earshot, his voice low with disbelief. "The mayor, beloved by half this city for her charity work. You're telling me a 10-year-old girl just identified her as connected to a child trafficking organization?" "I'm telling you, Sophie doesn't draw things randomly. She's drawn that symbol dozens of times without ever once mixing it up with anything else." Emma's jaw was set, fierce and certain. "If she drew that woman's face right after what happened to you tonight, it's because something about tonight reminded her." Matthew sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair, the implications settling over him with dizzying weight. Mayor Whitmore sat on charity boards with half the city's wealthiest families. She'd cut ribbons at children's hospitals, championed foster care reform, built her entire public image around compassion, for exactly the kind of vulnerable children Emma had spent 2 years quietly protecting. "There's a gala," he said slowly, memory surfacing. "This Friday. Whitmore's annual charity fundraiser. The same event Victor's been pressuring me to attend for weeks, insisting it's important for the family's public image." "Victor Hale? Your financial advisor?" "He's handled the gala invitation personally for the last 3 years." Never explained why it mattered so much. Something cold settled in Matthew's stomach, as pieces he'd never thought to examine began arranging themselves into an entirely different shape. I need to attend that gala. Then I'm coming with you. Emma, if this is what I think it is, then you'll need someone who notices details you might miss, exactly like you said last week. She crossed her arms, immovable. I'll go as staff. Nobody looks twice at catering. Matthew wanted to argue. He found, studying the fierce resolve in her face, that he genuinely couldn't. The gala unfolded across 3 sprawling floors of the city's grandest hotel, chandeliers throwing gold light over silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, string quartets threading music through conversations about donations and campaign contributions. Matthew moved through it in his own tailored black, shaking hands he didn't trust, smiling at faces he now suspected of unspeakable things. Emma moved differently, invisible in her catering uniform, weaving between conversations with a tray of champagne flutes, exactly the kind of quiet, unremarkable presence she'd perfected over 11 months in his own household. She found him near the terrace an hour in, setting down her tray just long enough to lean close under the pretense of refilling his glass. "Third floor," she murmured. "There's a restricted hallway past the coat check. I watched 4 men go in over the last 20 minutes. None of them have come back out. Recognize any of them? 2 city council members. A judge I've seen on the news." Her eyes flicked toward a cluster of well-dressed men near the bar. "And Victor Hale went in 10 minutes ago." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Stay close to the crowd. I'm going to see what's behind that door. Not without me. Emma, you need eyes that notice details, remember? Also, I'm wearing an apron and carrying a champagne tray. Nobody's going to question a caterer refilling glasses down a service hallway." Her expression brooked no argument. "You, meanwhile, are the single most recognizable man at this event. If anyone sees you skulking near a restricted room, that's the story they'll remember tomorrow." He hated that she was right. They found the hallway exactly as Emma had described. Unmarked, discreetly guarded by a single man in a suit, who waved Emma through without a second glance the moment she lifted her tray meaningfully, while Matthew slipped past through a service entrance 30 seconds later, moving with the quiet precision of a man who'd navigated far more dangerous spaces than a hotel corridor. Voices carried faintly from behind a closed door near the hallway's end. Emma paused outside it, arranging herself as though restocking a nearby table, close enough to listen. "Shipments delayed until the harbor inspection clears," a man's voice said, muffled but audible. "We move the inventory next Thursday instead. The mayor won't be pleased with further delays. The mayor understands patience serves her better than exposure." Emma's blood ran cold. Inventory. She'd heard enough warehouse conversations over the years, working catering jobs before the mansion, to know exactly what kind of business dressed human lives up in language that sterile. She backed away carefully, nearly colliding with Matthew rounding the corner from the opposite direction, his face grim with whatever he'd overheard from his own vantage point. "We need to leave," he murmured. "Now," quietly. They made it halfway back toward the ballroom before a hand closed around Matthew's arm, pulling him gently but firmly toward a private alcove. Victor Hale, smiling with the same polished warmth he'd worn for 11 years, managing Matthew's finances, eyes carrying nothing at all behind the practiced charm. "Matthew, glad you could make it tonight." Victor's grip tightened, subtle but unmistakable. "Walk with me. There's someone at the head table who'd love to finally meet you properly." Matthew allowed himself to be steered, Emma trailing several steps back with her tray, watching with growing dread as Victor guided him toward a private banquet room at the hallway's far end. Once inside, once the door had closed behind them, Victor's smile finally, completely disappeared. His hand moved beneath the edge of the linen tablecloth, and Matthew felt cold metal press briefly against his ribs before Victor withdrew it, just as quickly, the message delivered with lethal clarity. "You should have stopped digging," Victor said quietly, pleasantly, as though discussing the weather. 15 years, Matthew. 15 years I've managed your finances, watched you rebuild everything your father lost, and you never once looked closely enough to see what was sitting across your own desk the entire time. Your black crest. I'm considerably more than that. Victor's smile sharpened, cold and utterly unfamiliar beneath the mask he'd worn for over a decade. And you, Matthew, are about to become a very unfortunate accident. Tragic, really. All that talk of legacy, gone in a single moment of carelessness. The barrel of Victor's gun pressed briefly harder against Matthew's ribs, a reminder, rather than a threat, yet fully executed. And Matthew felt the old, familiar calm settle over him, the same stillness that had kept him alive through the afternoon's assassination attempt, sharpened now by 14 years of practice, keeping fear entirely out of his voice. You'll have every family in this city hunting you within the hour, Matthew said quietly. Killing me here, at Whitmore's own gala, in a room full of witnesses who'll remember exactly who escorted me inside. There won't be witnesses. There'll be a tragic medical episode. Heart failure, perhaps. So sad for a man still young. Victor's smile hadn't wavered. I've planned considerably more delicate operations than this, Matthew. You're simply the loose end I should have handled years ago, the moment I realized how much you resembled your father in all the wrong ways. My father discovered you. Your father discovered a fraction of us. Enough to believe he'd won. Something bitter flickered behind Victor's composed expression. He never understood that cutting off one visible branch does nothing to the roots buried beneath decades of respectable faces, legitimate businesses, campaign donations that buy considerably more silence than bullets ever could. Matthew's mind raced, calculating angles, distances, the precise timing required to close the gap between himself and Victor's weapon before the door burst open. A tray of champagne flutes shattered against the floor as Emma barreled through, shouting something about a spilled tray with theatrical panic that drew every eye in the room. And in the half-second of chaos that followed, Matthew moved. He seized Victor's wrist, forcing the weapon downward, driving his shoulder into the older man's chest, with enough force to send them both crashing into the linen-draped table. The gun fired once, harmlessly into the floor, before Matthew wrenched it free entirely, leaving Victor gasping against the overturned table legs, all pretense of civility finally, completely stripped away. Security! Emma's voice cut sharp through the room, no longer performing panic, but genuinely commanding it, drawing Daniel and two of Matthew's men through the door within seconds. Victor didn't resist as Daniel hauled him upright, his composed mask cracking into something considerably uglier, fury, and beneath it, the particular fear of a man who'd spent 15 years believing himself untouchable. This isn't finished, Victor spat, as Daniel forced his arms behind his back. You have no idea how deep this goes, Matthew. Kill me, arrest me, it won't matter. The Black Crest doesn't answer to one man's ambition. It never has. Matthew straightened his jacket, breathing hard, meeting Emma's eyes across the wreckage of the room. Get him out of here, he said quietly. Quietly. I don't want Whitmore knowing we've taken him until we understand exactly how deep this goes. They regrouped at the mansion past midnight, Daniel securing Victor in a location Matthew preferred not to discuss in detail, Emma pacing the study with an energy that hadn't fully settled since the gala. Financial records, Daniel said, spreading printouts across Matthew's desk. I pulled everything on Victor's private accounts the moment we left. Shell companies, offshore transfers, donations funneled through 3 separate charities, including 2 that Whitmore personally chairs. He tapped one column grimly. The money trail connects directly to shipping manifests through the harbor district. Cargo that never matches what's actually declared. Children, Emma said quietly. Disguised as legitimate freight, moving through ports Victor's shell companies have quietly controlled for the better part of a decade. Daniel's jaw tightened. This isn't small, boss. This is the same infrastructure your father fought 15 years ago, rebuilt and considerably more sophisticated. Matthew stared at the documents, the full scope of what he'd stumbled into finally, terribly clear. Not a single traitor, an entire network, hidden behind respectable faces for over a decade, operating in the same city he'd spent his adult life believing he controlled. "I need to see Sophie," he said finally. If she recognized Whitmore's face specifically, there might be more she remembers, more that could help us understand exactly who's involved beyond Victor. Emma nodded, already reaching for her coat. "I'll come with you." They found the church quiet when they arrived, most of the children long asleep. Rosie, keeping watch near the door, with the tired vigilance of someone who hadn't fully relaxed since Father Gabriel's disappearance. Sophie was awake, sitting alone near the window, sketchbook open on her lap. "Sophie," Emma knelt beside her gently. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" The girl looked up, her eyes moving between Emma and Matthew with the same careful assessment she brought to everything, before finally, slowly, nodding. Matthew crouched to her level, keeping his voice soft. "The drawing you showed me, the woman's face. Can you tell me anything about where you saw her?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her small hands tightening around her pencil. "The boat," she finally whispered, so quietly Matthew had to lean closer to catch it. "She came to the boat, with the other man. The one with the ring." "What ring, sweetheart?" Emma asked gently. Sophie flipped several pages back in her sketchbook, revealing a drawing Matthew hadn't seen before. A man's hand, rendered in careful detail, a distinctive crest ring visible on one finger. Matthew's breath caught. He recognized that ring. He'd seen it 100 times, on a hand that had shaken his own countless times over the years, offering condolences, congratulations, careful words of caution about trusting too quickly. Victor's ring. But the hand in the drawing wasn't Victor's. The fingers were different, older, a hand Matthew had known his entire life. Before he could process what that meant, before he could ask Sophie a single further question, something shifted in the air of the church. A subtle change in pressure, a distant, muffled thud from somewhere near the entrance that made every hair on Matthew's neck rise at once. "Emma," his voice had gone flat, urgent. "Get the children down. Now." She didn't question him, already moving, already calling softly but urgently for Rosie to wake the older children and herd the younger ones toward the rectory's interior rooms. Matthew crossed to the window, peering carefully through the boarded gap, and felt his stomach drop entirely at what he saw. Dark figures, moving in coordinated silence across the street, converging on the church from 3 directions at once. He didn't have time to shout a warning. The explosion tore through the church's east wall in a deafening roar of splintered wood and shattering stained glass, the force of it throwing Matthew backward into the nearest pew as fire and smoke rolled through the sanctuary in a single, devastating instant. Matthew came up choking on smoke, ears ringing, the sanctuary around him a chaos of fire and screaming children scrambling toward the rectory's interior rooms. "Emma!" His voice tore raw through the smoke. "Emma! Here!" She emerged from the haze, dragging 2 younger children by the hand, her face streaked with soot and blood from a shallow cut above her brow. "I'm here. I've got most of them. Rosie's got the rest." Gunfire cracked outside, Daniel's voice shouting commands Matthew couldn't fully parse through the ringing in his ears, and he forced himself upright, sweeping the chaos for any child still unaccounted for. "Sophie," he said. "Where's Sophie?" Emma's face went white. They searched the burning sanctuary in a desperate, frantic sweep, Daniel's men fighting a controlled retreat against the armed figures still pressing toward the church from the street. Until finally, the fire forced them back, coughing, defeated, standing in the rain-soaked street watching the church they'd built a sanctuary inside collapse into ruin. Every child was accounted for, except Sophie. "She was right beside me," Emma said, voice breaking, staring at the smoking wreckage. "I told her to stay close. I turned around for 1 second. "This wasn't random," Matthew said grimly, scanning the retreating attackers' vehicles disappearing into the dark. "They came for her specifically. She's the only witness who can identify Whitmore and whoever else was on that boat." Emma's hands were shaking, but her voice, when it came, was steady with fury. Then we find her. On the ground near where Sophie had been sitting, half burned but legible, lay a single page torn from her sketchbook, the only thing she'd managed to leave behind, whether by accident or desperate intention Matthew couldn't say. Not the crest, not a face, a drawing of docks, cranes, and a row of numbered shipping containers, rendered with the same careful, obsessive detail Sophie brought to everything she remembered. "The harbor," Matthew said slowly. "She's telling us where." Daniel assembled the crew within the hour. Matthew's mansion transformed into a war room of maps and tactical plans. Every available man briefed on a target that had, until tonight, existed only in Matthew's father's 15-year-old case files. "Terminal 7, Daniel said, spreading a harbor map across the table, tapping a cluster of warehouses at the water's edge. "Decommissioned officially, but power draw's been climbing for months. According to utility records, nobody thought to flag. It matches the container numbers in Sophie's drawing almost exactly." "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without eyes inside." Daniel's jaw was tight. "Boss, this isn't a small operation. Satellite imagery shows at least a dozen armed men on rotating patrol. If Sophie's there, and if this is truly Black Crest infrastructure, we're not looking at a rescue. We're looking at a war. Then we go to war." Emma stepped forward before Daniel could argue further, her coat already on, jaw set with the same fierce resolve Matthew had come to recognize as entirely immovable. "I'm coming. Emma, this isn't, if they're my children, I'm coming." Her eyes didn't waver, meeting Matthew's with a certainty that silenced whatever protest had been forming in his chest. "I've spent 2 years learning every one of those kids by name, by fear, by the specific way each of them takes their tea when they can't sleep. Sophie trusts me. If she's frightened and in the dark somewhere in that terminal, I'd rather she see my face than a stranger's, no matter how well armed." Matthew looked at her for a long moment, every protective instinct in him screaming to lock her safely inside the mansion, and found, beneath that instinct, a deeper recognition that Emma Jensen had never once needed his protection to become exactly who she already was. "Then stay close to me," he said finally, "and do exactly what I say, when I say it. I make no promises." Despite everything, despite the smoke still clinging to his lungs, and the terror of Sophie somewhere in that terminal, Matthew felt the ghost of a smile tug at his mouth. And somehow, I expected that answer. The storm had returned by the time they reached the harbor, wind driving rain sideways across the abandoned docks, Terminal 7's rusted gates looming ahead through curtains of gray. Daniel's men fanned into position around the perimeter, weapons ready, waiting on Matthew's signal. "There," Emma whispered, pointing toward a smaller structure at the terminal's edge, separate from the main warehouse. "A guard shack. Why post someone there specifically, unless it's not empty?" Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Daniel, take 2 men, clear the main warehouse quietly. Emma and I will check the shack." "Boss, that's not the plan. It is now." They moved through the rain toward the smaller building, Matthew's weapon drawn, Emma close behind him with a steadiness that belied the fear he knew she carried. The shack's door hung slightly ajar, swinging faintly in the wind, and Matthew pushed it open slowly, sweeping the dark interior. A figure lay slumped in the corner, bound to a metal chair, head hanging forward, barely visible in the gloom. "Father Gabriel?" Emma breathed, rushing forward before Matthew could stop her, dropping to her knees beside the old priest, fingers already working at the ropes binding his wrists. "Oh God, Matthew, help me!" Matthew crossed the room quickly, checking the priest's pulse, faint but present, his face swollen and bruised in ways that spoke of days of mistreatment, his once neat clerical collar torn and blood-stained. "Father," Emma's voice was gentle, urgent. "Father Gabriel, can you hear me? It's Emma. You're safe now, I promise. You're safe." The old man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening slowly as recognition dawned through the haze of pain. "Emma," he rasped, voice barely audible. The children. Some are safe. We're looking for Sophie now. She cradled his face gently in her hands. You need to save your strength. We'll get you out of here. No. His hand closed weakly around her wrist, urgency cutting through the exhaustion in his voice. You need to know. Before it's too late. Know what, Father? His eyes moved to Matthew, something desperate and grave in his expression, the look of a man who'd carried a truth too dangerous to speak for far too long. Whitmore, he whispered, each word costing him visible effort. She's not the one at the top. I served with your father, Matthew. I saw the real files, before they disappeared. Whitmore answers to someone else. Someone your father trusted completely. Matthew's blood ran cold. Who, Father? Gabriel's grip on Emma's wrist weakened, his eyes beginning to lose focus again, consciousness slipping despite his visible struggle to hold on. It's not the mayor, he managed, barely a whisper now, the words dissolving into unconsciousness even as he fought to finish them. It's... He went still, breath shallow, but steady. Whatever name he'd been about to speak lost to the darkness pulling him under. Outside, gunfire erupted across the terminal, sharp and sudden, tearing through the storm. He's alive, Matthew said quickly, checking Gabriel's pulse again, despite the gunfire erupting outside. Unconscious, but stable. Emma, stay with him. Absolutely not. She was already on her feet, fury and fear tangled together in her expression. Sophie is still out there somewhere. I'm not sitting in a guard shack while a 10-year-old is alone in the middle of a firefight. Matthew didn't have time to argue. He radioed Daniel, relaying Gabriel's location and condition, and together he and Emma moved out into the storm-battered chaos of Terminal 7, gunfire tearing bright flashes through the rain-soaked dark. Daniel's crew had breached the main warehouse, a running battle unfolding between rows of shipping containers, muzzle flash and shouted commands cutting through the wind. Matthew pulled Emma behind a stack of rusted crates, scanning the chaos for any sign of a small girl who might be hidden somewhere in the middle of it. There, Emma's hand gripped his arm, pointing toward a smaller container near the water's edge, its door secured with a heavy padlock unlike anything around it. That one's different. Newer lock. Why would an abandoned terminal have a brand new lock on one specific container? Matthew's jaw tightened. Stay behind me. They moved low and fast between cover, Daniel's men drawing the bulk of the gunfire toward the main warehouse, until they reached the container Emma had spotted. Matthew shot the padlock twice, the sound swallowed by the storm and ongoing firefight, and hauled the heavy door open. Sophie sat huddled in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, eyes wide with terror that shattered into pure relief the instant she saw Emma's face. "Miss Emma! I'm here! Sweetheart, I'm here!" Emma was inside instantly, gathering the girl into her arms, checking her over with frantic, gentle hands. "Are you hurt? Did they hurt you?" Sophie shook her head, burying her face against Emma's shoulder, small body shaking with sobs. She'd clearly been holding back through sheer terrified will. Matthew stood guard at the container door, weapon raised, watching the chaos of the ongoing battle, and felt every muscle in his body go rigid as a familiar figure emerged from the smoke near the main warehouse. Victor Hale, supposedly secured at a safe house across the city, walked calmly through the crossfire, as though the bullets themselves recognized his authority and simply declined to touch him. Beside him, moving with the same unbothered calm despite the storm, soaking through an elegant coat entirely inappropriate for a warehouse gunfight, walked Mayor Eleanor Whitmore. Matthew Leary. Whitmore's voice carried easily over the dying gunfire, Daniel's men securing the last of the resistance behind her. "I confess, I underestimated you. Your father made the same mistake, believing he could dismantle something built into the very foundations of this city." "It's over, Eleanor." Matthew kept his weapon steady, positioning himself firmly between the mayor and the container holding Emma and Sophie. "Victor's testimony alone will end you. The financial records, the shipping manifests, Sophie's identification. There's nowhere left to hide." Whitmore smiled, and the warmth that had won her 3 consecutive elections curdled into something genuinely chilling. "You still don't know who built the Black Crest," she said. "I didn't found this organization, Matthew. I inherited it, the same as everyone before me. Did you truly believe a network capable of surviving 15 years, capable of rebuilding itself from ash while the entire city celebrated its destruction, was simply the ambition of one mayor and her financial advisor?" Matthew's blood ran cold. Then who? Gunfire from Daniel's crew forced Whitmore and Victor back behind cover, the question left hanging unanswered in the storm, and Matthew turned his full attention back to protecting Emma and Sophie as the final exchange of the battle tore through the terminal. It ended within minutes. Daniel's men, better trained and better prepared, overwhelmed the remaining resistance, securing Victor Hale in restraints, while Whitmore, cornered near the water's edge, with nowhere left to run, finally surrendered with the icy composure of a woman who still believed, somehow, that this defeat was temporary. "You'll regret this," she told Matthew, as Daniel forced her hands behind her back. "This organization has survived worse than one angry son seeking his father's redemption. We'll see." Emma emerged from the container, with Sophie held tight against her side, the girl's face pressed into her shoulder, refusing to look at the wreckage around them. Rosie and 2 of Matthew's men were already moving through the terminal's outer buildings, discovering room after room of frightened, malnourished children. Dozens of them, Matthew realized with growing horror, far more than had ever gone missing from Emma's church alone. This operation had been running far longer, far wider than anyone had suspected. "They're alive," Emma said, voice thick with tears as she watched the children being gathered, wrapped in blankets, led toward waiting ambulances. "Matthew, they're alive." He crossed to her, pulling both her and Sophie carefully into his arms, feeling something in his chest finally, fully break open after 14 years of careful, deliberate numbness. "You did this," he murmured against her hair. "All of it. You saved them long before I ever knew to look." "We saved them," she corrected, voice unsteady. "Together." Hours later, once the terminal had been secured, and the children transported to safety, Matthew sat alone in the back of his SUV, an evidence bag resting on his knee, recovered from Victor's private office within the terminal's administrative building, discovered during the final sweep. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age, his father's handwriting unmistakable across the front. Daniel had found it in a hidden compartment, behind Victor's desk, tucked alongside decades of financial records connecting the Black Crest's current operations to accounts dating back long before Matthew's father had ever declared victory over the organization. Matthew turned the envelope over slowly in his hands, reading the 4 words written across its front with a hand he hadn't seen in 15 years, and felt the ground shift beneath everything he'd believed about his own family's history. To Patrick Leary's son. Matthew didn't open the envelope until he reached the mansion, sitting alone in his study long after Emma had gone to check on Sophie and the other children settled temporarily in the mansion's east wing, long after Daniel had finished briefing federal agents on the terminal's evidence. His hands weren't steady when he finally broke the seal. The letter inside was written in his father's careful hand, the ink faded but legible, dated barely 2 weeks before Patrick Leary's death. A death Matthew had always understood as a heart attack, sudden and unremarkable, the quiet end to a man who'd supposedly already won his war. "Matthew, if you're reading this, then I never got the chance to tell you myself, and I suspect that means I was wrong about something I desperately wanted to be right about. I didn't destroy the Black Crest. I want you to understand that clearly, because I let this entire city believe otherwise. And I let you believe it too, because I thought I was protecting you. I found the political leaders. I found proof reaching into the mayor's office, the courts, positions I never imagined organized crime could touch. I was 2 days from exposing all of it when my doctor changed my medication. A simple mistake, they told your mother. A tragic coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence, son. I never did. I'm writing this now because I suspect I won't have the chance to finish what I started, and if that's true, I need you to understand. The war isn't over. It only went quiet. Watch for the symbol. Watch for anyone who resurfaces with old money and new faces. And Matthew, trust carefully. The person who poisoned me sat close enough to know my schedule, my medication, my movements. It was someone inside our own circle. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't finish this myself. Dad, Matthew set the letter down with hands that had gone entirely numb. 15 years of grief and misunderstanding crashing over him at once. His father hadn't failed. He'd been murdered, silenced 2 days before he could expose the truth, and Matthew had spent 15 years honoring a false legacy of victory instead of finishing the war his father died fighting. He didn't hear Emma enter the study. He only registered her presence when her hand settled gently on his shoulder, her eyes finding the letter still open on his desk. Matthew. He didn't fail. His voice came out rough, unfamiliar even to himself. 15 years, and I let myself believe he simply won and walked away. He was murdered, Emma. Murdered by someone inside our own family's circle, days before he could finish exposing them. Emma pulled a chair close, sitting beside him without hesitation, her hand finding his across the desk. That's not a failure either, she said quietly. That's a man who got closer to the truth than anyone else ever managed. Close enough that they were terrified of what he'd find. I've spent 15 years fighting the wrong battles, believing a peace that never actually existed. His throat tightened. I built an entire identity around finishing something I didn't even know was unfinished. You're finishing it now. Her grip on his hand tightened. Tonight, Matthew. Tonight you finished what he started. Victor's in custody. Whitmore's exposed. Dozens of children are safe because you refuse to look away, the same way your father refused to look away 15 years ago. She reached up, gently turning his face toward hers. He'd be proud of you, not because you avenged him, because you became exactly the kind of man who couldn't ignore an injustice, even when it would have been easier. Matthew looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd spent 2 years quietly saving children in the shadows of his own indifference, who'd walked into a burning church and a warehouse gunfight without a moment's hesitation, who'd somehow, without ever intending to, taught him how to feel something again after 15 years of careful, deliberate numbness. I spent 11 months barely noticing you, he said quietly. I don't know how I managed that. You were busy being terrifying. It's a full-time job, apparently. Emma. Matthew. He kissed her then, slowly, carefully, like a man relearning something he'd forgotten he was capable of, and Emma kissed him back with the same fierce, unwavering warmth she brought to everything. Both of them finally, quietly letting go of years of grief they'd each carried alone for far too long. Daniel's message arrived just past midnight, breaking through the fragile peace of the study with the particular urgency Matthew had learned to dread. Encrypted transmission intercepted. Source unknown. Message reads, Black Crest cell number 7 is still active. Matthew stared at the words, Emma's hand still warm in his, and felt the war he'd only just begun to understand, stretching out ahead of him, far from finished. 6 weeks later, the church stood scaffolded and half restored, sunlight pouring through new stained glass windows Matthew had commissioned from a craftsman his mother once favored, the ruined sanctuary slowly rebuilding itself into something whole again. The dismantling of Black Crest Cell number 7 had taken every one of those 6 weeks. Federal agents working alongside Daniel's intelligence, Victor's testimony unraveling names Matthew hadn't dared hope existed, until the network that had operated invisibly through Boston's Harbor District for over a decade finally, completely collapsed. Mayor Whitmore's trial would take months to resolve, but her power, her influence, her carefully cultivated respectability, all of it had crumbled the moment the first headline broke. Sophie no longer flinched at loud noises. She still didn't speak often, but she'd started drawing flowers instead of crests, and Emma counted that as its own kind of victory. You're staring at the ceiling instead of helping, Emma said, appearing beside Matthew in the church's half-finished nave, a smudge of paint across one cheek. I'm admiring the craftsmanship. You're avoiding the ladder because you hate heights and won't admit it. She grinned, wiping her hands on her jeans. It's fine. I've made peace with your one weakness. I have several weaknesses. Name one. He looked at her for a long moment, something warm and certain settling behind his eyes. You, he said simply. You've been my weakness since the night I followed you into the rain. Emma's teasing faltered, something softer taking its place. The refuge officially opened 3 months later. Licensed now, funded legitimately. No longer hidden in shadows but standing proud on a street that had once given up on it entirely. Rosie ran the kitchen with full staff behind her. A rotating team of counselors, funded by Matthew's slow, deliberate conversion of half his empire into legitimate enterprise, worked alongside Emma to care for children who no longer had to fear discovery. Matthew found her that evening, in the restored sanctuary, alone, running her hand along the new pews with the same quiet wonder she brought to everything she'd built. "I have something to ask you," he said, and something in his voice made her turn immediately, catching the small velvet box in his hand, before he'd even fully knelt. "Matthew, you taught me that kindness done quietly matters more than kindness done loudly," he said. "You taught me that the people everyone else overlooks are often the ones holding entire worlds together. I spent 14 years building an empire on fear, and you walked into it and rebuilt me into someone who finally understands what my father was actually fighting for." He opened the box. "I don't want to keep fighting alone. Marry me, Emma." She laughed through sudden tears, pulling him up before he'd finished kneeling, answering him with a kiss instead of words, though the word followed a moment later, breathless and certain. "Yes. Obviously yes, you impossible man." Weeks later, cataloging the last of the evidence recovered from Terminal 7, Daniel found an old, water-damaged ledger buried in a sealed evidence box nobody had prioritized amid the flood of testimony and financial records. He brought it to Matthew's study, setting it down carefully on the desk. "Names," Daniel said quietly. "Black Crest leadership. Across the country. Most of them are crossed out. Accounted for, arrested, dead. But one entry isn't." Matthew opened the ledger slowly, scanning the careful, decades-old handwriting, until his eyes stopped on a single line near the back. Unmarked, uncrossed, waiting. Beneath it, a handwritten note in different ink, considerably more recent than the rest. "The founder has never been identified." Matthew looked up, finding Emma in the doorway, her expression mirroring the same cold certainty settling through his own chest. They'd defeated Boston's Black Crest. But somewhere, still hidden behind a face no one had ever thought to suspect, its true architect remained. Boston's Black Crest is gone. Every child from that harbor is safe. And a man who spent 14 years running on fear finally found something worth building a whole different life around. If this story made you believe in that kind of quiet, unshakable love, hit subscribe, because stories like this one are exactly what this channel is here for. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment that got you? Was it the church? The lighthouse? Matthew finally opening that letter? Also, drop where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Type Miss Emma below if she just became one of your favorite heroines. Thank you for watching until the very end.